Welcome back to Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I'll be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 7 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, Richard and Kahlan arrive at Zedd's home, where he announces that Richard's condition is serious and predicts he'll be unconscious in a matter of hours. Please note that these episodes contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet and you intend to, I encourage you to read the books first, and then come back and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, I find something new to think about every time I read them. At the beginning of this chapter, best estimates place the time since the beginning of Wizard's First Rule on the second day. Chapter 7 begins the chapter with Richard being led by Zedd and Kahlan into the old man's house. Richard describes himself from the perspective of an increasingly dissociative state. The Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders by American Psychiatric Association defines dissociation as an altered state of consciousness in which normally integrated mental processes become separated. This separation leads to disruptions in awareness, memory, and identity. Voices seem far away and incoherent, and his balance is severely impaired, and his perception of the passage of time is also altered as well. Richard has a hard time maintaining an active hold on his senses and rational mind. Based on the description of physical effects Richard is experiencing, there's an argument to be made that ketamine, or a ketamine-like substance, was also part of the drink that Zedd gave to Richard in the last chapter. In September 2020, Stephen Cohen of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine co-authored an article titled Ketamine Toxicity, where he describes sedation, impaired consciousness, disorientation, anxiety, confusion, dizziness, and hypotension, and that is lowered blood pressure, as common side effects of ketamine. You could also make a similar case for a large dose of THC, but that argument wouldn't explain the amount of time that the medication took to take effect. Ingested amounts of THC take much longer than the few minutes that passed between Richard drinking the medicine and feeling like he was going to pass out. Ingested, ketamine is a much faster-acting drug that can take effect in as little as 5 to 10 minutes. Zedd and Kahlan take Richard inside and put him to bed, where he spends the next few hours slipping in and out of consciousness as he experiences inconsistent levels of rational awareness. Goodkind often links a person's ability to live effectively with their ability to exercise the discretion of their rational mind. A practitioner of objectivism places an absolute importance on the use of logic and reason to direct the events of their life in a healthy and productive way. As Richard lies in bed suffering from fever and delirium, Kahlan sits next to the bed and tries to comfort him however she can. The author creates a story circle for Richard as he describes the frightening experience of what it's like for a person to lose their perception of reality. The first half of the Wizard's Sixth Rule states that the first law of reason is what exists, exists, and what is. And from this irreducible bedrock principle, all knowledge is built. It is the foundation from which life is embraced. When a character loses their ability to know what is and what exists, they lose access to the vehicle that makes life possible. And while physically they may be alive, they're not living. Richard is the protagonist, and he begins the call to adventure when he's put to bed so he can rest while Zedd tries to help him. Richard is forced to leave his comfort zone when the medicine and fever take away his ability to perceive reality effectively, which creates acute anxiety through cognitive dissonance. He attempts to adapt to this unfamiliar environment and expel his anxiety by trying to assert control over his situation. He tries to overcome his vertigo by holding onto the bed, and he desperately tries to hold on to his thoughts in his mind as they slip away. Richard gets what he wants when he wakes up and recognizes his mother comforting him. His mental pain was not able to resolve itself through rational means, so he creates an additional piece of information that makes a new self-contained reality that is less painful than the one he's living in. This world that he creates does not require a root in reality because it is explained and created by a rationalization. The Farlex Partner Medical Group defines rationalization as a defense mechanism through which irrational behavior, motives, or feelings are made to appear reasonable. That means to Richard the feelings of comfort are used as the proof that his problem has been solved, rather than addressing the issue directly. Richard pays a heavy price when he encounters a fact that contradicts his rationalization, bringing back the pain of his mother's death. Richard returns to his original starting point, having been changed by the event when he pushes his fantasy aside and chooses to live in the reality where his life is in danger. The story of Richard slipping in and out of consciousness is also an allegory for how the wrongly innocent live their lives. According to objectivism, those who elevate their own emotional tranquility above logic and reason are mentally adrift in a sea that is composed of unverified information. Richard is able to walk and lie down with the help of others in much the same way that the emotionally guided individuals are able to pass and exist in the world and interact with it. However, the allegory attempts to compare a lack of access to logic and reason as a severely debilitating condition. The senses cannot be trusted. Full access to the mind is impossible due to the lack of agency that is in the instinctive response to cognitive dissonance. With full access to the mind cut off, self-contained rationalizations are formed in response to the psychic pain and act as an analgesic. In this allegory, the author describes these rationalizations in the same way that a doctor would describe an opioid painkiller. A sometimes necessary extreme measure that can do more good than harm in the short term, but warns through Richard's fight to dismiss the pleasant lies he's told himself that in the long run, the overuse and abuse of self-rationalization will create a dependency that is as powerful as any drug. Long-term users are no longer able to achieve a feeling of normalcy without a constant supply of new rationalizations to explain the constant paradoxes that occur when one's reality is based on pleasant, affirming, but contradictory information. I often turn to social media interactions for my examples because they're a fertile breeding ground for broken wizards' rules. While you will find a wide distribution of personalities engaged in hyperbolic rhetoric. While outliers exist, many of these groups are centered around a source of emotional validation. The causes are different, but the dynamic is the same. Validation is offered. Paradoxes that contradict the validation are challenged by those who are not validated by the initial claim, and those challenges are dismissed violently, because the acknowledgement of them removes the validation, triggering a painful psychic detox of pent-up cognitive dissonance. Rather than address the source of the dissonance, another source of validation is sought, continuing the cycle of addiction. While Richard hangs between consciousness and unconsciousness, he recalls the events of his father, trusting him to memorize the Book of Counted Shadows. In the Hopi oral tradition and the Archaeology of Identity, authored by Wesley Bernandi in 2005, we're given that the passing down of information from father to son was a common practice among members of the Hopi people, and among many other cultures as well as a method of preserving valuable information and culture. However, the author's account of Richard's memorization diverges from Wesley's assertion that traditional oral traditions are not meant to be taken as a historical record. Rather, they are to be taken as a hypothesis and starting point that histories can use to gain a deeper understanding of how their traditions impacted the passage of their oral tellings. While that establishes that the passage of information by memorization and subsequently the spoken word, a more fitting example of memorization of information for the purposes of protecting it can be found related to Ray Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451. From Bradbury's own explanation and analysis of the symbolism contained within the book, he states that it isn't the government that is the villain, but it is the people themselves. The censoring of books wasn't done by the government, but rather by the people, as they sought to avoid uncomfortable thoughts and disturbing concepts. Being unwilling to address the difficult conversations that arise from a contradiction between public narrative and reality, the response was to seek to remove all evidence and expression of dissenting points of view. This closely mirrors the social phenomena we witness where large groups of people choose to cut out entire sections of information or the people who share that information from their lives completely. Rather than explore the cause of their cognitive dissonance, they distance themselves from the source of it as much as possible. In Fahrenheit 451, the memorization of books was considered to be a subversive act. While the application of that information is different from the Book of Counted Shadows and the Sword of Truth, the symbolism is exactly the same. When information is threatened and a rational citizen wishes to protect it, the one place they can be sure it is safe and untainted by outside forces is within that person's own mind. In Objectivism and the Sword of Truth, the rational mind always represents the source of all life. The integration of the text within the rational mind as a way to protect all life is both figurative and literal example of how an individual can fight back against those who would lay a claim to all or part of their lives. The rational mind is absolute and cannot be breached through force. It can only be subverted with the consent of its owner. George Cypher took Richard into the woods where he spent several months memorizing the exact words of the Book of Counted Shadows by writing down what he could remember and checking it against the original words of the text. Other than the occasional fond memory, we aren't given much information about Richard's childhood. We learn in Chapter 19 of Stone of Tears that the Cypher household valued literacy, and that as a reward for learning how to read, Richard was given the book The Adventures of Bonnie Day. We later learned that Anne and Nathan were responsible for making sure the Book of Counted Shadows and The Adventures of Bonnie Day were in George Cypher's possession shortly after Richard's birth. The question about whether Richard's adopted father would have pursued this type of education for Richard on his own, or if that direction was instilled into him at Nathan's direction, is a valid topic that will be more fully explored in future episodes of this series. This section references a beast that was sent to guard the Book of Counted Shadows until its master could come and claim it. We later learn that Darkenrall sent the beast, and it is because the beast was linked to his magic that Darkenrall was able to find Richard at all. Darkenrall later uses this link to his magic to track Richard by the bone he carries. Richard is told by his father that the information from the book was only meant for the keeper of the secret book, but his father doesn't know who the keeper of that secret book is. If Richard is unable to find the true owner of the book, then he is to pass this information on to his children, and so on until a rightful owner can be found. During the first read-through, the reader doesn't have enough information at this point to ask the questions of how much of this interaction was organic and how much of it was influenced by Nathan. Given the information provided in Stone of Tears about Nathan's involvement in getting the Book of Counted Shadows into George Cypher's possession, and Nathan's established position that sometimes terrible things need to happen to ensure the right side of prophecy is followed, so that an even worse tragedy does not occur by following the wrong branch. It seems likely that Richard's introduction to Darkenrall is ensured by Nathan's direct intervention. Nathan and Anne help George Cypher recover the book. They also help him defeat the beast that was guarding it. In Chapter 20, Darkenrall assumes that George Cypher took the tooth from the beast as a trophy. In this instance, Rall makes a mistake. He acknowledges that someone came along with the skill to defeat an underworld beast. He does not give the proper weight to the competence of his adversary and accept the simplest and least meaningful explanation of why a tooth was taken. Nathan makes sure that Richard's adopted father gives him the tooth and tells him it is the only way to prove to the true owner of the book that his father wasn't a thief. This is a clear-cut example of how Nathan is using the wizard's first rule to manipulate George Cypher, and by extension his intended target Richard, and he swallows it hook, line, and sinker. Richard wants to believe that his father isn't a thief. Richard is afraid someone will think his father is a thief and what that would mean to his reputation and the memory of his father. Richard links the feelings conjured by branding someone a thief and removes all context from the situation, with the conclusion being that if Richard can't prove his father wasn't a thief, the judgment of others somehow removes the justification and reasoning behind taking the book to keep it safe. The reality of the situation is that George Cypher is a thief, but rather than focusing on the cognitive dissonance created by calling someone a thief and having that brand link them to a predetermined moral standing, Richard should have been focusing on the tangible facts of the scenario that state the object was being stolen and it was being stolen for the right reasons. In that scenario, George Cypher's honor and integrity are left intact, without dismissing the reality that he did steal something that did not belong to him. That is always the method that Goodkind uses to show when a wizard's rule is being broken, when feelings are placed above reason and facts are set aside to prioritize the feelings surrounding an issue. Nathan, being a prophet as well as a wizard, would have been well schooled in the wizard's rules and how to use them. He creates what he knows will be a powerful and irrational attachment to the tooth that was taken from the beast. This links Richard to the Book of Counted Shadows by magic leading directly back to Dark and Raw, and triggers Richard's involvement with the entire plot. Without Nathan's intervention, Wizard's first rule would likely end at Chapter 7 or shortly thereafter. Richard is only able to make it into the Midlands by using knowledge about the Book of Counted Shadows to deduce the existence of a pass. Richard's tooth from the beast becomes pivotal again in Chapter 14 when Zedd and Chase are struck unconscious by underworld beasts. We learn in Chapter 17 that it was the bone he wore around his neck that kept the underworld beasts from seeing him. By Chapter 36, Richard knows that Zedd is the true keeper of the book, but his fear for what his friend might do to him in the name of the greater good compels Richard to keep the secret from him. If Zedd had found out about Richard's knowledge of the book in a different way, there's no telling how it would have impacted the rest of the novel, which heavily depends on Richard figuring out this information and how to use it on his own. That single bone and that use of the wizard's first rule to link it in Richard's mind to his father's honor initiates the entire series of events leading to Richard's involvement, and prevents the entire prophecy from being derailed at least 3 different times, which isn't bad for a guy who spent the last 1,000 years living in a cave. Richard's father tells him that he can't tell anyone about the book except the rightful owner. He can't tell his brother, he can't tell his best friend Zedd, or anyone else. It would also be possible to explain this statement with Nathan's influence. Richard doesn't learn Zedd is the true owner until Chapter 36. Without an irrational attachment to his father's instruction to not tell anyone, even Zedd, it is possible that Richard would have put the pieces together much sooner when he realized that Zedd was the forgotten great and honorable wizard, and likely would have been the caretaker of such things. The paradox of don't tell Zedd and only tell the rightful owner is able to influence Richard's judgment long enough to keep him from connecting the dots and preserve the secret until he figures out how to defeat Dark and Raw with it. After an extended amount of practice, Richard was able to write the entire book 100 times from start to finish without missing a single word, noting that based on its content, any omission would spell disaster. There might be an allegory to be made about Richard's father insisting that the information that Richard is learning belongs to him and him alone, and that the repetition represents the internalization of logic and reason being a personal choice that an individual must come to on their own. I'll leave that up to your own individual interpretation. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. Was the author using this structure as a parallel of personal accountability to our own choice to pursue logic and reason above emotion? The exact moment that we are told of Richard's awareness that proper access to the knowledge in its entirety is essential to prevent disaster is the exact moment we're given the mechanism that this will be used to resolve the threat presented by Dark and Raw in Wizard's First Rule. From the exercise of handwriting the book from start to finish, it's also an excellent primer for some of the core skills that Richard displays later in the rest of the books. A post by topeducationdegrees.com titled 20 Reasons to Write by Hand According to Science claims that the physical act of writing down things by hand has benefits that go beyond the simple transfer of data. Some of the listed benefits include increased memory, improved spelling, increased creativity, improved right brain involvement, and improved visual processing skills. Additionally, the exercise of memorization improves neural plasticity, the speed of memorization, focus, and creativity. Given the length and difficulty of the text that Richard was memorizing, given the skills necessary to complete the task, this would have given him a huge leap forward in his academic and cognitive development. Additionally, Richard constantly displays many of these talents at key moments. Creative problem solving, attention to detail, excellent memory, visual processing, extreme focus. All of these are skills that end up making the difference between success and failure later on in the series. Given how close some of these situations end up cutting it, there's an argument to be made that by directing him to memorize the book, Nathan was doing everything he could to give Richard as many mental tools as possible. Once Richard is sure the book has been properly memorized, they leave it hidden for 3 years. When they come back and he's able to perfectly recite the book from memory after such a long time, Richard said he's ready to destroy it so that the knowledge could be protected without the danger that accompanies a physical copy. Goodkind reinforces the emotional bond Richard creates and attaches that to keeping this secret. His secret is the trust of his father and the trust of everyone. Richard identifies this as the moment he is no longer a child. Rites of passage into manhood are well documented around the world. In an article called Male Rites of Passage from Around the World, theartofmanliness.com lists bungee jumping from a wooden tower with a vine, cattle jumping, and enduring 10 minutes of bullet ant stings without making a sound, amputation of the pinky, all as rites of passage into manhood. When the book is cast into the fire, the heat and flames are sucked into it with a bitter cold wind that surrounds them. When the wind finishes, the book is gone. Right after the book absorbs the fire, the author describes 2 phantoms that appear, wailing with the fire until they are gone. That passage about those 2 phantoms is difficult to interpret. Within the entire Sword of Truth series, there's only one other instance where the word phantom is used to describe something that isn't meant to convey stealth or imaginary. In Pillars of Creation, Zedd unleashes a constructed spell that conjures phantom soldiers to cut down Imperial Order troops. There is only one explanation I can think of that might be close to the truth. I have no direct evidence to support my theory, and what I've come up with relies heavily on assumptions that I cannot verify. So please, the next theory I present, take it with an appropriate amount of skepticism. We eventually learn that the book Richard memorized was one of several fake copies produced for the express purpose of hiding the true key to the boxes of Orden. The true key is the Sword of Truth. The boxes of Orden and the Sword of Truth are both able to pass through the veil. The sword is able to call forth the spirits of previous wielders via the Dance of Death. The boxes of Orden grant the wielder dominion over life and death. Since the fake copies of the Book of Counted Shadows were created as a ruse to hide the true purpose of the Sword of Truth, then it is possible that the ones who made them included some tie to the underworld so that the books would feel like they belonged to the boxes of Orden, and burning them released the tie in the form of wailing phantoms. I know, it's a bit of a stretch. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Am I chasing magic phantoms and looking for meaning that isn't there? When Richard regains consciousness, he notices Kahlan sitting next to him with Zedd's cat on her lap. Zedd's pet is described as a big old coon cat. This variety of cat lives on average 9 to 13 years, but with good medical care and a little bit of healing magic, it is possible for them to live as long as 18 years. And they can get as heavy as 34 pounds. However, since Zedd's cat is male, their average weight is usually closer to 12 pounds. Kahlan tells Richard that Zedd has left to find the route he needs to help him. And Richard realizes that Kahlan is the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. Richard tells Kahlan that Zedd is like a second father to him and asks him to promise her not to hurt him 4 times in a row. Kahlan tells Richard that she will not make a promise that might cause her to break other, more serious promises that she has already made to the people that Dark and Raw has put at risk. Richard looks at the situation from Kahlan's perspective and realizes that she's right. Additionally, if the request is presented to him in a way that imposes a mandate on his actions, without regard to his agency of consent, Zedd may choose to reject the proposition entirely on principle alone, turning a tough sell into an impossible one. Richard apologizes and asks Kahlan if she will wait for him to get better so he can try to convince Zedd to help her before she does anything to try and force him. Richard has already figured out that Zedd is the great wizard from the Midlands, and he still has the image of Kahlan grabbing him by the throat fresh in his mind. It's likely that Richard is worried Kahlan might accidentally violate the wizard's second rule by causing harm through an action with good intentions behind it. Kahlan could destroy the chance to get the old wizard help when she tries to do what she believes will help her get the old wizard's help. Once Kahlan gives her word to wait, Richard allows himself to go back to sleep. Zedd's cat wakes up when he hears something and goes to sit in front of the door. Washington State University's College of Veterinary Medicine wrote in the article, "Do cats hear better than dogs?" that the feline sense of hearing can hear things from up to 5 times further away and at a higher frequency than human beings. Zedd displays the Clark Kent effect when he calls for his cat to come inside while he is outside, only to have it run past him like he isn't there when he opens the door to come inside. Kahlan creates cognitive dissonance in Zedd when she asks if he found the root that Richard needs. As the personification of pride, Zedd takes offense and is unable to keep himself from making a sarcastic remark that he wouldn't have come back if he hadn't. I searched for over 2 hours trying to find a root that matched the description of the one in the book before I accepted that approach as a lost cause. Attempting to engage the hive mind of Reddit was also futile. The question never even made it to the public. In a last-ditch effort, I engaged the hive mind of the official Goodkind and Sword of Truth fan page. The question generated 50 comments in less than 60 minutes. I'd like to recognize Eileen S. Flynn for her contribution. Without her, the next few sentences of this video would not have been possible, so thank you, Eileen. Given the information provided by the text, the most likely candidate for the root that Zedd used to help Richard is pokeweed. He peels the root and cuts it into pieces before boiling it for several hours. Pokeweed is very toxic and is boiled before ingestion. It is listed as having properties that can enhance the immune response. MDPI is a publisher of peer-reviewed open-access journals, and in an article titled Pokeweed, Antiviral Protein, a Ribosome Inactivating Protein, Activity, Inhibition, and Prospects by Artem D. Dumavesky and Dixie J. Gose, suggested that PAP has the potential to be converted into an effective immunotoxin, stimulating immune cells to attack tumors or cells in the same way that targeted therapies do. This could be a more scientific explanation for when Zedd says the thorn will not be able to stand the root and that it will be forced to leave his body. On its own, that might not be enough to count as a solid deduction, and I would have agreed with you until I also learned from Eileen that pokeweed is common in Nebraska, the state that Terry Goodkind was born and raised in. Zedd tells Kahlan Richard needs to be awake to drink the liquid in the bowl. In the next section, we see the first time the author uses language that reveals Zedd has magic when he wakes Richard up by pressing his finger to his forehead. He pulls the old, "you keep squeezing this rag while I secretly use magic to wake Richard up without you noticing" trick on Kahlan, and it works. Zedd gives Richard his drink and Richard falls back unconscious. With Richard deeply unconscious, Zedd asks Kahlan what a confessor is doing without her wizard, and she tells him that he sold his services to a queen. Zedd is unable to hide his displeasure as first wizard when he learns that one of his students had abandoned his duty to the confessors, which is a highly ironic position for Zedd to take after he chose to abandon his duty to the Midlands. However, to be clear, it is not ironic because Zedd was wrong to abandon the Midlands to live his life. He was perfectly within his rights to do so. The irony comes from judging him for walking away to pursue his life. Despite Zedd's decision to walk away, he's unable to hide his concern when he learns that all the other wizards committed suicide after helping Kahlan cross the boundary. When Kahlan asks Zedd if he knew the old wizard when he lived in the Midlands, he says that he did. But even if she could find him, he doesn't think he would be inclined to help. We're better able to understand the next interaction between Zedd and Kahlan if we continue to view Zedd as a symbol of pride and Kahlan as a symbol for justice. Kahlan makes her case to Zedd about why she thinks she will be able to convince the old wizard to help by stating all of the injustices that have been inflicted against her people. People are having the fruits of their labors stolen from them in the name of the greater good. Wizards are forbidden from using their talents, and people are told it is the fault of the great wizard for not coming forward to be put on trial as an enemy of the people. She describes Darkenrall as a leader who uses false flags and emotional gaslighting to convince people that others are responsible for his actions, even though the reality they are presented with clearly shows Darkenrall and his soldiers are the ones with the blood on their hands. Zedd shows either tremendous conviction or tremendous empathy when the author interrupts Kahlan's story to devote an entire sentence to say he continues to allow her to hold his hand. Kahlan goes on to say that even if the wizard chooses not to help the people for the sake of altruism, he will have a selfish motivation to do so, because if Darkenrall continues unopposed, on the first day of winter he'll have the power to find and destroy the old wizard regardless of where he's hiding. She says that if she cannot convince the old wizard with logic and reason that by helping her he also helps himself, that she will use her power on him to force him to. Note the change in narrative tone after Kahlan finishes speaking. Zedd recognizes that Kahlan is currently ignoring the wizard's 14th rule, which states, In this world, everyone must die. None of us has any choice in that. Our only choice is how we live. Kahlan struggles to find balance with this when she recognizes the wizard's ownership of his own life, when a large number of people might benefit from his help. But she does not apply that same reasoning after the number of people who would potentially benefit reaches a certain number. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, the issue is no longer centered around what the proper moral course of action is. Now she's just haggling over the price. The objectivist themes represented by the wizard's rules define this type of reasoning as a form of existential violence. To claim any part of another man's life without their consent is a form of existential violence, regardless of the promises made to justify such a claim. The cognitive dissonance is created by those who want to acknowledge the benefits of whatever end they feel justifies their means, while refusing to acknowledge the results of their existential violence when a person's free will is taken from them and used against their will for a cause they did not consent to pursue. Rather than digging in and making his case directly, Zedd applies the wizard's 13th rule. He knows he cannot change the nature of humanity by force. Instead, he uses a measured response of truth and love to avoid feeding her cognitive dissonance. This is expressed by the text when Zedd is described as holding her hands in his. He knows that he needs to let that storm rage itself out before he will be able to get through to her, before he will be able to interact with her in a rational way. It's similar to the way a hurricane works. Hurricanes are powered by warm, humid air rising through colder air. When a hurricane is over warm water, the hurricane gains energy. And as the hurricane moves over cooler water or land, it loses energy and gradually loses strength. Once they move inland, they are cut off from water and they rapidly weaken. To enable this, Zedd compassionately prompts her to continue working through her own train of thought. Playing devil's advocate, Zedd asks Kahlan what she thinks one dried-up old wizard will be able to do against Dark and Raw. Kahlan says that the wizard must appoint a seeker. And Zedd tells Kahlan that she doesn't know what she's talking about because a seeker isn't created by their appointment. A seeker is created by a person's actions and recognized by a wizard. The recognition by the wizard just makes it official. After he has acknowledged Kahlan's emotional pain and has not fed into her cognitive dissonance, Zedd makes his own case for the wizard's 14th rule when he explains how the position of seeker is assigned. Zedd tells Kahlan that she has all of the right information, but she has it backwards. He says, a seeker of truth is only made by someone who has chosen to act that way, and implies that one of the core qualities of a seeker is that they are able to recognize the truth is rooted in reality beyond all claims made that it does not. This means imposing the position of seeker onto someone who does not possess the defining traits of a seeker would invalidate the entire exercise. Or to put it another way, it's impossible to circumvent the truth to create a seeker of truth. Zedd references the wizard's first rule when he says that people rarely believe the truth when they see it, and even less when they don't want to. Zedd goes on to say that because a seeker's existence will contradict the message of those who are acting from a position of viciousness instead of virtue, that they will draw lightning from many sides. The English mathematician Isaac Newton states in his third law of motion that every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. This statement means that in every interaction, there is a pair of forces acting on one of the two interacting objects, and that forces always come in pairs, equal and opposite, action, reaction, force, pairs. Goodkind shows a deep understanding of this dynamic in Chapter 9 of Phantom, when Nikki purposefully tries to subvert this dynamic to create a backlash capable of defeating the beast that was hunting Richard. She attempts to create an action, but withholds the reaction until that is no longer possible. Since a contradiction can't exist, one of the forces attempting to subvert the laws of nature, once they're no longer able to do that, all of the force and energy spent over time attempting to do so are released in a single instant. To extend this theory to natural human responses when they express cognitive dissonance, we see that this law mirrors the last part of Wizard's 13th rule. Any other weapon will be unsuccessful or will make the cognitive dissonance more powerful. Simply put, by exerting force against cognitive dissonance, you create an equal and opposite force that strengthens that cognitive dissonance. From this point on in the series, I will be referring to this dynamic as the conservation of cognitive dissonance. Zedd tells Kahlan that even if a seeker was appointed, he wouldn't be able to stand up to Darkenrahl. Kahlan says you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and out of all the bad options they have, this is the best one. Zedd says even if they did pick the right person, they wouldn't be familiar with the Midlands and would quickly be killed. Kahlan explains that she has given her consent to offer her life and services to whomever the wizard appoints, and reveals that she has extensive knowledge of the geography, customs, and language of the Midlands. She also references drawing her fair share of lightning, a little bit of a reference to her Kandar. Later on, it's revealed that she is talking about the way her confessor's power functions. One of the summations of her power is that it creates a complete and blind devotion to her, and that includes the perfect fulfillment of any request she makes for someone to tell the truth. As a source of truth that by its existence contradicts assumptions people have made using cognitive dissonance, the comparison alone, this references the wizard's 12th rule that says you can destroy those who seek the truth, but you cannot destroy the truth itself. When Zedd says that she would be putting herself at risk and the life of the seeker at well, she tells him she already is at risk, and that if he has a better plan to handle things, then it's time to put up or shut up. Before he's given the chance to put up, Richard makes some noise which prompts him to shut up while he takes care of the thorn that is being expelled from his body. If we're continuing the symbolism that the thorn represents how a lack of adherence to the wizard's rules will eventually destroy a person, then note within the 2 chapters we have known Zedd, with the exception of the wizard's 7th rule, which Zedd displays at the end of this chapter, Zedd leads his life in harmony with all of the wizard's rules. There are clear-cut examples of each one where he is presented with a situation and responds with actions that are consistent with each of the rules we learn about in future books. This explains why Zedd is presented as a healer, and why symbolically he is the one with the ability to save Richard from the thorn. If a symbol for the lack of adherence to the wizard's rules makes Richard sick, then a symbol for following these rules is needed to make Richard well. It is action and reaction, the conservation of cognitive dissonance. We see Kahlan sees the thorn come free and she wants to touch it. And Zedd says don't touch it because once it's expelled from the host, it will be eager to find another. This is another representation of the engagement legitimization dynamic that allows the proliferation of ideas rooted in emotional reaction rather than rational thought. By engaging these ideas, you legitimize them and then make them stronger. So Zedd shows her that refusing to feed the thorn is the best way to kill it, because once it works its way inside and becomes a part of you, removing it is exponentially more difficult and more painful. Instead of touching it, Kahlan throws the thorn in the fire. Zedd asks her why she hasn't told Richard the truth about what she is, and she says Zedd already has the answer to that question based on how he reacted when he realized what she was. Kahlan recognizes that lying to him isn't fair, but feels justified in continuing the ruse a bit longer until she's forced to leave with the Seeker to complete her mission. Kahlan says that she will tell him then. Zedd recognizes that Kahlan is breaking the wizard's 10th rule, which states, "The truth is what should motivate your life, not the lies, or you will fall victim to the first rule. And if you ignore the truth, you're betraying everything that you believe in, because the lie is more convenient to you than reality." And again, rather than engage in this conservation of cognitive dissonance, he instead applies the wizard's 13th rule and shows her compassion instead. Zedd tells Kahlan that he acted foolishly and apologizes for treating her that way. He demonstrates to her how a person can transition from hostility, stemming from irrational emotional responses, reinforced by cognitive dissonance, into friendship when he acknowledges all of his feelings and the reasoning that he has behind it, but immediately explains how his feelings were not a justification for the way that he treated her. He asserts his respect for her profession as well as an acknowledgement of her worth as a good person, and says she's welcome in his home. Kahlan takes a moment to internalize his words and thanks him for that. After telling Kahlan that he's willing and able to interact with her as an equal, he summons an expression of menace that makes it perfectly clear that if she uses her power on Richard, or chooses him to be his mate, then he will not be happy about that, and she would know. Kahlan uses emotional gaslighting to tell Zedd that she wouldn't do that because he is her friend, and that it is important to her that he understands this. Following a mix of the 1st, 5th, and 13th Wizard's rules, Zedd does not engage her attempts to appeal to his emotion, and gives a non-committal response that is addressed only in the factual part of her statement, and does not engage with her attempts to evoke tangible feelings of empathy for an intangible promise of intent. Zedd says if that proves to be true, it would be the best possible version of the truth, and leaves it at that. Zedd is curious why Kahlan hasn't asked him to help her find the wizard, and she tells him that she promised she wouldn't until Richard was better. After she demonstrates the ability to have a conversation with him that does not devolve into emotional gaslighting, and her willingness to engage his perspective from a position of moral equivalency, Zedd says that she might make a good seeker. If you're taking the character of Zedd into full consideration, then it's important to recognize that he always chooses his words carefully and does not make a habit of putting in extra words that do not contribute to his overall point. When Zedd says Kahlan might make a good seeker, there needs to be due consideration of the word might. When he made that statement, this word would have been introduced as a qualifier when Kahlan expressed her justification for using her power to force the old wizard to help her against his will in the name of the greater good. Zedd recognizes many of the qualities that would make a good seeker, but Kahlan's belief that there is a moral justification for it would disqualify her until she could prove that she has grown past that. Zedd tells Kahlan to go to bed, and she says no, she'll be staying right here with Richard. Zedd tells her that's fine as he pulls the old sit in this chair while I touch the sides of your head and use magic to make you fall asleep trick, and it works. Zedd displays either an ability to communicate with animals or an amazing level of pet training when he tells his cat to come in from outside and sleep on Kahlan's lap to keep her warm. While the words of the text seem to imply that Zedd uses magic to compel the cat to follow his commands, it is possible that the cat's behavior can be explained through mundane means. In an article by PetTango.com titled Everything You Need to Know About Maine Coon Cats, it says that Maine Coon cats can be creatures of habit. This trait makes them easy to train when they associate an activity to something they like, such as coming inside or sitting on someone's lap. By using positive reinforcement training that rewards good behavior, Maine Coon cats can be trained to accept a harness and a leash. That means that a spoken command to come here and a nonverbal command to go somewhere else are not completely outside the realm of possibility if Zedd has put the time into teaching his cat these basic skills. As the owner of 3 cats, I will say anecdotally I can speak to this. After a period of months using only positive reinforcement techniques and the auditory cue of finger snapping, each of my cats has been trained to listen when I snap my fingers and tell them it's time to leave the room of the house that they are in. Zedd takes a walk outside and mutters the first recorded instance of his catchphrase that nothing is ever easy. This statement tells us that Zedd is using his magic to scan the area for trouble and that he's found it. We get confirmation of this when Zedd is bit by a fly and swats it, recognizing it as a blood fly. Zedd's action prompts an attack from a short-tailed gar. The more powerful and more dangerous cousin of the long-tailed gar that Richard and Kahlan faced in Chapter 4. Zedd uses his magic to freeze the gar in place. For a second time, we see something that is either a display of an ability to communicate with animals or a display of the intelligence of gars. He asks the gar what its name is, and once it answers, Zedd says he will remember it and gives the beast the choice to live or die. I tend to think that this instance is a reflection of the gar's intelligence and not a magical compulsion. We don't explore the complex social abilities of the gar until Richard befriends one in Stone of Tears, but we are introduced to the concept of their individuality and ability to comprehend the spoken word. He tells the gar to find the quad, kill them, return to Dahara, or he will kill them and feed them to his flies. He then asks the gar if he consents to his terms, which he does, and Zedd allows the beast to fly away. In Chapter 4, Richard and Kahlan are both representations of partially developed characters regarding their adoption and acceptance of the wizard's rules. In this instance, Goodkind displays a level of interaction where the use of force is applied to overcome the barbs of those who would break with reason in favor of protecting their own emotional equilibrium from the pain of confronting and resolving the contradictions they face. Symbolically speaking, if the short-tailed gar is an even more dangerous version of the emotional gaslighting and other techniques that are fueled by the targeted manipulation of cognitive dissonance, then Zedd's personification of total understanding of the wizard's rules represents a perfect knowledge of what the offender is capable of, including the different steps that they follow and its reasoning that it uses to reach the conclusions that it does. Zedd's threat against the Gar is representative that in some situations it's possible to create a strong enough force that the source of the cognitive dissonance is not powerful enough to overcome it and is destroyed rather than strengthened. That interaction will be later introduced symbolically through the Sword of Truth's ability to cut and destroy through anger. Zedd activates his Cloud Rock and creates a Technicolor light show that rapidly cycles through the 4 seasons faster than a Vivaldi record on high-speed playback. Zedd uses his Wizard's Rock to summon the spirits of his parents, and they ask him what's the matter. He says he's bothered by what Kahlan has to say, and his parents confirm that it's all true and tell him he needs to appoint a seeker. Zedd flashes back his memory to the High Council, turning their backs on him, and says they can live with the consequences of their actions. Rather than feed into Zedd's cognitive dissonance, his father asks him some questions that make Zedd realize he's violating the wizard's 7th rule by living in the past. Zedd mentions that there is one test left Richard has to pass before he can be the Seeker, and his parents tell him that won't matter when everyone is dead, but they still have a chance now because Dark and Raw only has one of the 3 boxes of Orden. Zedd also learns that he does not have the Book of Counted Shadows and is looking for it, and that Dark and Raw is able to travel the underworld. Our first piece of information about the underworld tells us that there are things inside it that can be gathered and organized, and that Dark and Raw will be ready for them if they try to use it the same way to get back to the Midlands that Kahlan used to get there. Zedd has more questions for his parents, like how they will get to the Midlands and why is Dark and Raw after Richard, but his parents tell him that he's a smart boy and he'll be able to figure out things on his own. Zedd's parents are pulled back through the veil and tell him not to summon them again because doing that could tear the veil. Richard's parents are most likely referencing the Skrin. We learn later on in the novels that the Skrin are guardians of the veil and they try to keep everything where it belongs. In Temple of the Winds, we see Richard's reference the Skrin when he interacts with them to get into the Temple of the Winds. Summoning ancestor spirits during times of crisis becomes a theme in Stone of Tears and Temple of the Winds, and is referenced as having the ability to tear the veil between the underworld and the world of life. Finally, his parents fade away, and Zedd is revealed by name to be the great and honorable wizard that everyone was looking for. Zedd takes some time to process his parents' advice that he is breaking the wizard's 7th rule. Realizing that nothing is ever easy and accepting that, Zedd ponders how to move forward. It's time for the official number 1 quote from Seeking the Truth about the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 7. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official number 1 quote from this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your number 1 quote for this chapter may be. In the event that your number 1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for number 1 quote in the comments below. And the official number 1 quote is, "If offered a choice, dear one, that is the way I would prefer it." In the next chapter, Richard wakes up and tricks Zedd into being proud of him, and Zedd tells everyone that while he is happy to see them, that really is the Sword of Truth in his wizard's pocket. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you really like it, I ask that you share a link to this video with those who you think may enjoy it as well. If those feelings are not there yet, I invite you to come back for the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom, and I've been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth about the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time so that while I am seeking these truths, you can become seekers of that truth as well. Thank you, and I hope to see you again.